The Zelda timeline's really quite confusing, to be honest. I mean, it sort of makes sense until you try and add Breath of the Wild when it all just goes out the window. We've seen hours and hours of footage of this game, but still no one's come up with a concrete timeline placement. So today I thought I'd take you through why exactly it's so hard to place in the Zelda timeline, and given the circumstances, give my opinion on the most likely placement for the game. So, Breath of the Wild. A brave step for the Zelda series, changing up the formula, adding more traditional RPG elements, blah blah blah, we've heard it all before. But a question a ton of Zelda fans, myself included, have been wondering even since the game was first teased at E3 2014, is where the game takes place in the Zelda timeline. And sure, this should be a pretty easy thing to do, right? Considering how much we've seen of the game. We've seen landmarks like the Temple of Time, items like the Master Sword, we've had a good look at the overworld, the main villain, mini-dungeons and more. But still, no one has agreed on a single placement despite all of this material to work with. Why is this? To put it simply, Breath of the Wild is so big, with so many elements to it, that one part of the game will contradict the placement that another part of it seems to suggest. There's so much evidence for so many different placements that it creates a huge unsolvable mess. So today I'll run you through the Zelda timeline and show you what I mean. Okay, so first off we have the unified timeline, beginning with Skyward Sword as an origin story for the cyclical nature of the Zelda series, and telling the tale of the defeat of the original Demon King Demise. A lot of people have suggested a placement immediately after Skyward Sword would work, because of the similarities in appearance between the hero of Skies and the hero of the Wild, plus the fact that they're both the only canonical right-handed links. The hero of the Wild is told that he's been asleep for 100 years, and he's described as the light that must shine on Hyrule once again, suggesting that he's saved the world before, so people have theorised that he may be the return of the hero of the Skies. The goddess Hylia is also strongly featured in Breath of the Wild, being mentioned constantly by Sheikah monks. Many locations in the world being named after her, such as Lake Hylia, Mount Hylia and the Hylia River, and a statue of her being found in the Temple of Time. This, in addition to the vast, open, seemingly empty Hyrule, suggests a placement just after Skyward Sword, in the early days of the Hyrule Kingdom, since this was when the goddess Hylia was commonly worshipped, as opposed to later on in the timeline when she's mostly absent from religion in Hyrule. However, there are a few big things that disprove this idea. First off is the Temple of Time, which was built by Rauru long after Skyward Sword, after the era of Chaos. The temple is found on the Great Plateau, which means that the game has to take place after this time. Additionally, the main villain of the game, the Calamity Ganon, provides strong evidence that the game is placed after Ocarina of Time. We can see from the name and the appearance of the beast that this is some form of the iconic Ganon, who we know had his origins in Ocarina of Time. In the Nintendo 64 Classic, the Gerudo thief Ganondorf steals the Triforce of Power from the Sacred Realm, and uses it to exact revenge on Hyrule for 7 years. At the climax of the game, and after his defeat at the hands of the Hero of Time, he uses the Triforce of Power to become a monstrous boar demon known as Ganon. This is the first canonical appearance of Ganon, and explains how the monster came to be. With such an in-depth and epic origin story for the beast, it's very improbable Nintendo would invalidate it by retconning and including Ganon before this event. So with the Calamity Ganon being present in Breath of the Wild, this means that the game must take place after Ocarina of Time. But the strongest evidence for the game taking place after Ocarina is on the Great Plateau itself. Outside of the Temple of Time can be found the ruins of Hyrule Castle Market from Ocarina, including the fountain, main gate and iconic stone archway. And then slightly to the east, the ruins of what was once Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Castle itself. See my video on this subject for a more in-depth explanation. Okay, so that rules out the unified timeline, despite the evidence linking it to Skyward Sword. So which timeline would the game go into? Surely we have enough information to choose which one of these three very different alternate universes the game would fit into. Well, no, not really. Again, there's evidence to link to all three of the timelines, which I'll show you. Let's start off in chronological order, and the first timeline split, the Child Timeline, where the Hero of Time goes back before Ganondorf's rule in Ocarina of Time and warns Princess Zelda of his intentions, leading to his imprisonment. The games that follow Ocarina of Time in this timeline are Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures. What links Breath of the Wild to this timeline? The obvious answer is Wolf Link. If we consider Wolf Link canon, which he may or may not be in this game, that's a really clear-cut link, no pun intended, to the Child Timeline, and Twilight Princess in particular. As a quick note, this is definitely supposed to be the hero of Twilight in his wolf form, since the chain is still present on his leg. Since Wolf Link in Breath of the Wild uses the hearts saved from the Cave of Shadows, it's possible that his presence is some sort of stored memory of the wolf. Either way, if we consider Wolf Link canon, this must be a link to the Child Timeline since the character has appeared nowhere else. To further connect to Twilight Princess and the Child Timeline, there's the cryptic quote from IG Aonuma from a few months ago. I'm working on a new Legend of Zelda game now, and one thing I've realised as I've been working on it is that a lot of the things I want to do with this new Zelda game are things I thought of while making Twilight Princess. I can't talk specifics, but to me, Twilight Princess was a starting point, making it possible to do what I'm doing now in a way. I think it'll be fun for people to look back when you play the new Zelda and compare the two. What could he mean by Twilight Princess was a starting point for Breath of the Wild? The Calamity Ganon could further strengthen a placement in the Child Timeline, because he's referred to as the Calamity Ganon, and described as appearing from nowhere 100 years ago to spread ruin and corruption. It seems like the inhabitants of Hyrule had no idea who or what it was, leading it to be called the Calamity. The Child Timeline is the only one in which Ganon has not already laid waste to the world, since he's only appeared twice, once in Twilight Princess before Link, Zelda and Midna, and once in Four Swords Adventures before the Four Links and the Seven Maidens. Additionally, connecting the game to Twilight Princess is a landmark we see near the Great Plateau, a huge stone bridge suspended over a great lake. We see a similar bridge over a similar lake in Twilight Princess, the Great Bridge of Hylia. The visual similarities between these two bridges are very clear, so it's possible they're the same structure. We've never seen the Great Bridge in any game except Twilight Princess, so it can be inferred that it was built in the Child Timeline somewhere between Ocarina and Twilight Princess. So there's the evidence for the Child Timeline, which, if in isolation, would provide a very strong case for the game being set here. A good video to watch after this one if you're interested in more evidence for the Child Timeline is the theory by my friend HMK. However, there's equally strong evidence for the other timelines, all of which can be used as counter-arguments to the Child Timeline placement. The Adult Timeline is perhaps the most fitting of Breath of the Wild's apparently post-apocalyptic setting, since it's the timeline that Link left when he was sent back in time at the end of Ocarina by Zelda, leaving Hyrule after Ganon's defeat in what was called the Era Without a Hero. When the Demon King returned, the gods were forced to flood Hyrule to seal the kingdom and prevent Ganon's dominion of the land. In this timeline we have Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, the latter taking place in the new Hyrule Kingdom discovered by the Hero of Winds and Tetra, which we can discount obviously due to the presence of the Temple of Time and other old Hyrule landmarks in Breath of the Wild. As with the Child Timeline, there's an immediately obvious connection to Wind Waker and the Adult Timeline, the Koroks. The Great Deku Tree from the Wind Waker says that, once upon a time, long ago, the Koroks took on human forms, but when they came to live on the sea, they took these shapes. So Breath of the Wild has to be during the Adult Timeline, right? Since the Kokiri became the Koroks after the Great Flood to live on the sea. Well, sure, this is a good argument, but there's always the possibility that the Koroks are just another form of the Kokiri, and they can take it whenever they have need of it, and it isn't specific to the Great Sea. There must be some stronger evidence linking them to the Adult Timeline, like the fact that all Koroks we've seen so far in Breath of the Wild are Koroks from the Wind Waker: Elma, Olivio, Hollow, Aldo and Urch. For the Kokiri in Breath of the Wild to take forms that are exactly identical to named Koroks from the Wind Waker can't just be a coincidence, so it's possible that these are the very same Koroks from that game. Additionally, Link can find a peculiar item on the Great Plateau called rock salt, with a description, crystallized salt from the ancient sea. Except for the obvious Great Sea, what other sea could this be referring to that salt could have ended up on the Great Plateau in central Hyrule? Well, there's the Lanayru Sea from the ancient past, but that was far in the west, much further than the Great Plateau. For salt from an ancient sea to have ended up here could very well mean that this is a reference to the Great Sea once covering the entire land, which would also explain why the world is so full of lakes, rivers and other pools of water, and why all the buildings are ruins, like they've been worn down by years of being at the bottom of the ocean. The last piece of evidence for the adult timeline is a possible identity for the old man. Many fans, myself included, have pointed out the similarities between this mysterious old man and the king from the Wind Waker, King Daphnis no Hansen Hyrule. The facial structure, height and age all seem to match very well to the king, suggesting that he might in fact be hiding. Additionally, if you slow down the old man's jingle from Breath of the Wild, it sounds a lot like the Hyrule Castle theme often used to represent the king. A good summary for an adult timeline placement can be found in my friend Commonwealth Realms' theory. Okay, so that's the child and adult timelines down, both with strong but conflicting evidence. We've currently got Wolflink, Calamity Ganon's name, and the Great Bridge of Hylia for the child timeline, and the Koroks, the Old Man, and the Ancient Sea Salt for the adult timeline. What about the Downfall timeline? The Downfall timeline follows the events in an alternate universe where Link loses in the great battle against Ganondorf at the climax of Ocarina of Time. After Link's death, Ganondorf gained the full Triforce and became the Beast Ganon, before the sages sealed Ganon along with the Triforce for a time in the Sacred Realm. However, evil, greedy men sought the power of the Triforce and ventured into the Sacred Realm, each becoming monsters which added to Ganon's growing army. He then broke free and waged war on the kingdom. After a great battle, he was once again sealed, an event known as the Imprisoning War. This time is followed by A Link to the Past, the Oracle games, Link's Awakening, A Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. The most obvious, and in my opinion the strongest evidence linking Breath of the Wild to the Downfall timeline is the Master Sword. This scene from the game's reveal trailer is obviously a reference to the famous location of the Master Sword in A Link to the Past, even to the point where the flowers and lighting are the same. It's possible then that the Breath of the Wild Master Sword will be found in the heart of the Lost Woods, similar to how it was in A Link to the Past. We know in the child timeline the Master Sword was present in the Temple of Time's ruins in the Sacred Grove from Ocarina of Time all the way until after Twilight Princess. However, the Temple of Time is found on the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. The same inconsistency can be applied to the adult timeline. From Ocarina of Time onwards, the sword was in the possession of the royal family, ending up in Hyrule Castle until a Wind Waker when it was buried in Ganondorf's head at the bottom of the ocean. So since Breath of the Wild's Master Sword location conflicts directly with its known adult and child timeline locations but matches its Downfall timeline perfectly, this is some major points for the Fallen timeline. More connections to this timeline arise when you look at one of the biggest thematic choices of the game, Decline. Of course, a huge part of the Downfall timeline is known as the Era of Decline, and the Old Man describes the kingdom as having declined over time, as well as, its ruins. Additionally, just looking at Link's design in Breath of the Wild springs some connections to the Fallen hero timeline. He has long bangs, a feature we've only ever seen on Downfall timeline heroes, yet it's a stylistic choice present on every single one of them, from A Link to the Past all the way down to Zelda 2. This seemingly pointless hairstyle could lend some strong evidence to this timeline, since we know the hero of the Wild has saved the land before. Perhaps he's one of the Downfall timeline heroes. A good summary of a Downfall timeline placement can be found in this video by Nintendo World Report. So there we go. I've listed all the evidence I've found for all of the possible placements, and hopefully you can see just what a mess it is. There's so much evidence for all of the timelines, it's crazy. It makes sense that no one's been able to make absolutely convincing case for any one of these placements, since evidence that supports one placement contradicts another, which is then contradicted by a different piece of evidence and so on. It's so confusing. Where do I think Breath of the Wild takes place in the timeline? Of course, I'm not certain on it, as I've explained, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. I originally thought after the Wind Waker when the Deku Tree and the Koroks had drained the land completely, but now I think there's the strongest evidence for a placement just after Ocarina of Time in the Downfall timeline, just before A Link to the Past. What's more, I theorise that Breath of the Wild will tell the tale of the Imprisoning War, which I detailed earlier as the battle that ensued years after Ocarina of Time, when Ganon broke free from his seal in the Sacred Realm with legions of demons, and was resealed after a great battle. Why do I think this is the strongest placement, considering all the evidence we've found? Why is this a better placement than the adult timeline, supported by the Ancient Salt and the Koroks, or the child timeline supported by Wolf Link and the Great Bridge of Hylia? Well, I simply think that the evidence for this placement is the strongest of any of them. First off, we know that this game is after Ocarina of Time. As mentioned earlier, the ruins of Castletown can be found on the Great Plateau. These ruins aren't ancient. We can still see the outlines of what was once present, suggesting not too long has passed since the town's destruction. A placement before A Link to the Past would support this, since it would explain why Hyrule Castle and the town is in this state, because Link lost to Ganondorf, who became Ganon with the power of the entire Triforce and proceeded to stomp the land. Of course, a placement in the early Downfall timeline would also explain the placement of the Master Sword, since it lines up perfectly with the sword's position later on in the timeline in A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. And it doesn't just seem to be a reference, the Master Sword appears to be literally in the same location as A Link to the Past. A placement here could also explain the Calamity Ganon. Ganon in this game is said to have appeared 100 years ago and laid waste to the land. It looks as if he's going to need a good sealing if you ask me. It's possible that this is Ganon after he broke free from the Sacred Realm, and Link with the help of the sages will seal him again. Anyway, that's just my opinion on where the game might take place. As I've explained, there's way too much evidence for almost every other placement to make a final judgment. We'll just have to wait for more information. Where do you think Breath of the Wild takes place in the Zelda timeline? Leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, leave a like, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, it really helps me out. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.